Hey everyone, this is Pete and welcome back to another session of Evercade and Chill, where we're still playing some Activision games because I feel like playing a bunch of Activision games in this recording session, so you're going to have to just deal with that, I guess. Anyway, today we're going to play River Raid. Your mission is to score as many points as possible by destroying enemy tankers, helicopters, fuel depots, jets and bridges before your jet crashes or runs out of fuel. Each bridge you destroy is a checkpoint, so if you crash your jet or it is shut down, one of your reserve planes will join the fray from the last bridge you destroyed. If you have no reserve jets left, your mission is over. How far can you make it up the river of no return? So, I've covered this game previously on this channel, but doesn't hurt to talk about the history again. River Raid's designer Carol Shaw initially wanted to make a take on the popular arcade game Scramble, but was encouraged to find a different theme for it due to the oversaturation of space shooters at the time. Yeah, early 80s was very much Spaceship City. Everyone was obsessed with spaceships and spaceship shooting things. So the game became a vertical scroller after Shaw determined that horizontal scrolling would not work well on the original Atari 2600 hardware. The entire game fits into just 4 kilobytes, with the game world generated on the fly using a fixed seed to ensure it's with the same time each time someone plays. So this game uses procedural generation, but it is set up in such a way that it procedurally generates the same thing each time. And as a result, you've got a game that is massive but fits into 4 kilobytes, which is insane. Anyway, Katie's top tip for the day: keep an eye on your fuel gauge, but feel free to blast fuel tankers you don't need for bonus points. Let's play. Now, I've talked before that this is not my favourite version of River Raid, because I think the Atari 8-bit version is much better, because there's just a bit more variety to it. However, this does not mean that I don't like the Atari 2600 version. I still really like the Atari 2600 version. One of my fondest gaming memories is during Microsoft's short-lived Game Room service that they did on Xbox 360. For a very brief period, I was the 3rd best player in the world at River Raid. Brackets on Microsoft Game Room. Because I'm sure there's someone out there who has played this for many hours in a single session, scored 1 billion points, and so on. But anyway, I was pleased, because the one thing I really liked about Game Room was that it did live leaderboards, which meant that as you were playing, the leaderboard was visible at the side of the screen, and you could see yourself climbing up that leaderboard in real time. Which is something I haven't seen anyone do since. And it's something I really wish that Hamster would put into their Arcade Archives games, because it would be great, because they already have their high score mode and their caravan mode and so on, and those already display a leaderboard on the screen while you're playing, but they don't update your score live on that leaderboard while you are playing. Which is a shame, because that was one of the coolest things about Game Room, which is sadly missed. And I think it's a bit sad, because when Game Room was released, there was a weird kind of anti-retro gaming sentiment, or rather, there was a weird anti-paying for retro gaming sentiment. Like, although these were official re-releases of these games and you could play them with all these added new features and get bonus stuff for your avatar and your virtual arcade and stuff as a result, there were a lot of people who were like weirdly aggressively anti-Game Room. And that always struck me as a bit of a shame. Because it probably contributed to the thing shutting down. And it probably contributed to there not having been anything quite the same ever since. So that's a shame. But anyway. We are playing River Raid. And oh, how I love River Raid. It's such a simple idea, but so well implemented. It's just a straightforward, really elegant, well-designed, highly playable, incredibly compelling game that I've always been very fond of. It must have been one of the first games I played on Atari 8-bit when I was a kid. And it's one that stuck with me my whole life, one that I've always felt is very important to me. Like this is a game that has real meaning for me, and I associate with happy times and feeling nice and safe at home with family. It's just a lovely game. And it's one of those games that holds up very well today because it's very easy to pick up. You can tell what's going on despite the primitive graphics. And it's a straightforward, very timeless sort of game. Like, all you need to do, shoot things, score points. That is your sole aim in this game, along with getting as far as you can. That is a natural extension of the shooting things and scoring points. No! But yeah, this really elevated itself above a lot of similar games at the time, with additions for things like the fuel mechanic and the bridges and the different enemy formations and the different enemy behaviours and such like. But like I said, that's one thing I think the Atari 8-bit version does do better, because it has a wider variety of enemies and thus different behaviours to learn about. So in the Atari 8-bit version you have to contend with tanks that are sometimes on the bridges, sometimes on the banks of the river. There's also hot air balloons. There's a second type of helicopter that shoots. And so they're fairly simple changes to the basic formula, but they're effective ones that don't dilute it or make it overly complicated, but they really work well within the format of the game. But I also think there is a nice purity to the simplicity of the 2600 version. Because I play this and I don't find myself thinking this is too limited. Even though there's only, what, 3 types of enemies? There's the helicopters, there's the ships, and there's the planes that fly across the screen. And that's it. But because the game is continually challenging you to deal with those things in different combinations, different levels of intensity, it manages to remain consistently interesting despite just 3 types of enemies. And I think that's a real testament to what a well-designed, well-crafted game this is. It's something that you can really kind of learn something from, I think, in terms of game design. Because I'm sure the temptation when making a game, even back in the early 80s, was to keep adding new features, keep adding new things, because it would make the game more interesting for the player, surely. But it is very possible to reach a point where you have too many features. They're overwhelming, they're difficult to cope with, they're difficult to learn. And so having a bit of restraint definitely has its value. In the 2600 days, that restraint was often a side effect of only having 4 kilobytes of ROM to play with. But also, it's something that a lot of modern developers find when they deliberately constrain themselves in some way. A lot of people find that a really strong inspiration to creativity. Oh, damn it. Because if you can't do something, but you have a particular idea you want to implement, but you can't just implement it in a quote-unquote easy way, you have to get creative. You have to figure out how you can do the thing or something like it within the constraints you're dealing with. And that's why I think there's such a thriving movement of people who are making new games for old hardware. Because when you're dealing with those constraints, it's fun to be creative within those constraints, but also it can actually help people out as well. So, like, I'm willing to bet there's a fair few people who have, for example, made a GB Studio game for Game Boy, but they've been hesitant to make a game on a modern platform because they think they can't do graphics, or they can't do complicated sound, or they don't have the budget or resources to do something especially elaborate. But if you deliberately constrain yourself to something that runs on a low resolution monochrome 4 shades of grey device, that's probably a real help to solo developers. And it doesn't make their work any lesser. That is a much better way of democratizing creativity than shit like generative AI. Because one of the biggest examples that generative AI boosters like to use is that, oh, it democratizes creativity. It means that anyone can type in a prompt and create something. It's like, but no, you're not creating something, are you? If you can type in, show me a picture of a duck, and it goes and steals a picture of a duck from the internet for you, or creates a rough approximation of a picture of a duck based on the things it's stolen, that's not you creating anything. Whereas if you go, I made a Game Boy game, I drew all the sprites and they look a bit funny, but it's really low res, so it doesn't matter. That's creativity. And you know, GB Studio is free to download. Doesn't require huge data centers. Doesn't suck up vast amounts of drinking water. Doesn't create noise pollution. Unless you're like on a bus and someone's playing their Game Boy really loud. Although these days, if I was on a bus and someone was playing their Game Boy really loud, I would want to get to know that person. What was I talking about? River Raid. Whoops. River Raid and creativity within constraints. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that came about when Carol Shaw was making this. Because you can tell while you're playing this, there's ambition here. There is real ambition here. And it's no coincidence that that ambition led to one of the best Atari 2600 games. Because this is one of those games that frequently comes up on best Atari 2600 games of all time lists. And with very good reason. If you had a 2600 in the early 1980s, you probably had a copy of this. And if you didn't, well, I'm sorry you missed out, but you can still play it today and it's still fun today, so, you know, sort it out. I find it quite interesting that there have been attempts to recreate this formula, and yet none of them have been quite as good as the original. So for example, just on Evercade, on the Home Computer Heroes cartridge, there's an Amiga game on there called Bridge Strike, which is very transparently a River Raid clone. And I like that game, I think it's cool. But it's not as good as this. It's not as good as this. And I think to an extent it suffered from what we talked about earlier, which was that sense of feature creep where you feel the need to add more and more features to the game because, oh, 3 enemies isn't enough. But, you know, sometimes it is. Sometimes it's plenty. Because I can, and have done. Ow. I can quite happily sit and play this game for hours at a time. I won't put you through that today. We'll probably call it a day after this run. But yeah, there are certain games that over the years I've just really clicked with, and I will quite happily play non-stop. Even though they're theoretically the same each time you play. There's enough variation and human randomness when you're playing an arcade style game to make the experience just a little bit different each time. Even though the scenery is the same, the enemies are in the same place, the enemies behave in the same way, there's always going to be those little variations in how your thumb moves, your reaction times, whether or not you're getting distracted, whether or not a cat jumps on you in the middle of play, which I'm surprised they haven't. Because I've been sitting here playing Activision games for a good couple of hours at this point, and I haven't been interrupted by a cat, which I'm quite disappointed about, and I'm sure you are as well. I'm sure when it gets closer to dinner time they will feel the need to come and help. Oh no. That was foolish, foolish behaviour. Let's go this way instead, shall we? Let's just go this way. There's a website out there called the Video Game Atlas, and it features maps of games. And a lot of it is, as you would expect, maps of sort of 2D platformers and how their levels are designed and such like. But they also have maps of some 2600 games. So they've got a map of like adventure, as you might expect. But they've also got a map of River Raid. And their map shows that this goes on for like 500 levels or something ridiculous. And I don't even know if like the end of that map is like the end of when this game starts generating unique stuff, or if it's just that they ran out of space on the on the image file they were using for it. But yeah, if you're good enough, you could play this potentially for a very long time indeed. As it stands, I can manage about 12 minutes. 12 minutes for a single playthrough or so. But anyway, yeah, that is River Raid, an all-time favourite from the Atari 2600 library and the Atari 8-bit library, but the Atari 2600 one is the one we're concerned with today. Yeah, definitely an Activision game you should absolutely spend some time with if you've not done so before, because it's a lot of fun. It's a good game. It holds up really well. It's still very playable, still very compelling, still very, I know people don't like using this word these days, but still very addictive. It's still a very addictive game that keeps you wanting to come back and play some more. But anyway, I think we're done for today. Let's call that a day there. It just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.